don't know exactly what proportion of the workforce was farmers in 1900, but I have the impression it was something like 20%, and now it's 2%. So we had to find something else for 90% of our farmers to do. At the same time, so each farmer was able to take care of a lot more land and crops. And prices were falling for farm commodities relative to other things. Now, it's not uncommon for prices to fall. We don't expect computer prices to stay up as technology improves, and technology was improving for agriculture. And farmers were saying to themselves, we can't get by. If only the prices maintain the same proportion to input prices that they had in the past, we'd be getting along just fine. But instead, these prices are going down and down and down. We should have prices that bear the same relation to input prices that they used to have. That's the argument for parity. But that implies that all the benefits of technological progress go to farmers and none go to consumers. So I think it's perfectly sensible to say that terrible things were happening to farmers, and if we'd been a decent society, we'd have done something for them. But parity was a grab for more than they could reasonably claim, it seems to me.
Who wants to say? I thought.
I think parity has to be seen in terms of the fairness. The $15 an hour wage. With parity, a bushel of wheat would be around $17, equivalent to a 50. It's not at $17, it's way lower. We are using the power of the bank-created money to have policies in Congress for the last 60 years that have slowly been killing off family farmers by lowering the market price that they get, and they cannot afford to pay their costs, and they've been leaving, and it's been a slow boil, and it's been very, I think, very planned out, if you understand parity. And the other thing to keep in mind about parity is it's not just the farmer. You're talking about the entire economy, and if you, when you study it, you'll realize that it's talking about the money flows in the entire, all the sectors of the economy, because we don't have the creation of goods unless we have the inputs coming in, and that's the wealth. And the reason why it's in relation to farmers is because 70% of the new wealth that we take from the mines and the fields and everything, 70% is from the farm. It's a huge amount.
Okay, now a lot of people maybe in the room who don't know me, I'm Joe Bongiovanni. I should introduce myself since I'm here on the table. And I'm a second generation monetary reform person. So I learned about monetary reform from my dad. And why he learned about it, you know, is kind of hard to understand. He was really a manufacturer. My dad was a businessman, and but for several years, right around the time that I was born, and when his family moved out from New Jersey out to Long Island, my dad was farming. He wanted to take a try at it, because you know what? That was everything that was around there was farmland. That's basically what it was. So he got involved in several years, 4 or 5 years, I guess my mom said, of production, and later on he kept stressing you know, to the family about we really need to make sure that we can agriculture, okay, didn't make it as a farmer, because he had a background in manufacturing. And he kept saying about how important it was that we had to do something about it. But when he was trying to teach me about monetary reform, and I was kind of rejecting the idea that it could possibly be in any way important about anything going on in the world at the time, I recall, because he actually had an office in the basement of our house, and even as the president of the company, and I remember the conversations that he was having with people that he was talking to, mostly in Washington, but sometimes state representatives with regard to agriculture. And he kept saying that, no, we have to do all of this. We have to change the monetary system. We have to be able to, equitably distribute the wealth that's created somehow, more equitably. And he kept saying things about parity. He kept saying this stuff about agricultural parity. And it was something that was completely going over my head, and it stayed over my head. So I learned monetary reform without agricultural parity involved in it, okay? But Randy caused, a number of us who were involved in this to study it more and to read actually the history and to read how it actually did work. Okay, that's what I'm going to say in response to Nick. Is the fact that if there was a grab by the farmers for more than what we would consider parity, it didn't show up in any of the statistics or in any of the studies of the implementation of the policy. Because remember, it's a policy; it's a matter of government policy to do those kinds of things. So this goes back to like the difference between any of the other types of elements of the economy besides agriculture, which is that they can have prices that fall, and what's the significance of the price falling? Is that the consumers get things cheaper. But with agriculture, it's a matter of putting out of production, the people that are most closely tied to what it represents, and by that I mean that the corporations have taken over agriculture. Yes, have they produced cheaper food? Yes, they produce cheaper food. Have the cost of the unit of production gone down? Yes, they've gone down. What have they done to the soil? What have they done to the soil? Who's responsible for seeing that the future farmers have soil that's going to be able to be producing? And to me, these are the kinds of reasons why I'm coming around to appreciate and support the idea that what my dad was saying at the time was right, and what Randy's saying is right, is that if we're going to actually preserve the ability to produce the food that we need, and he puts it up there at number 3, I guess, it's starving, it's number 1. But if we're going to be able to do that, then we need a mechanism for doing it. We need a policy for doing it. We need a way to do it. We need to be able to accomplish that as a matter of public policy. And all I will say is this: if there's a better way to do that, then through the kind of mechanisms that Randy is proposing, let's talk about that. Let's not think that there's some other easy way to accomplish what parity can accomplish. So, me, warning, I'm all in for parity.
Very good. My name is Stephen Walsh. I've been at all of the AMI conferences too, and I'm learning and growing with all of this too, and I've been impressed with parity. I grew up in Chicago, but I spent every summer on farms in Minnesota, and maybe the more socialistic end of that, I had a uncle who was he was a farmer all of his life, but in his later years he was part of the federal government with the federal farm insurance program. And he'd go around, and talk to farmers about if you could put 2 pigs aside, but it costs you 2 pigs to have federal farm crop insurance. And I remember he went on a trip to Tanzania, and he explained federal farm crop insurance there and how it can work to save the farm when you all work together to do something incongruency. What Randy Cook said right at the beginning of his presentation, you may have remembered, it's like an insurance program that we, acting through our government, give to the farmers so they can get a base price. It isn't, and it's 90% of parity. Between 1942 to 1952, the cost of the program to government guaranteeing you this as an insurance company, they made $14 million off of it. The amount of money that was circulating through the farm system, through this parity program, was $224 billion. It allowed farming to work with industry, to work in a society where society was working in a way where there was harmony. I think Nick should get the last word on this, but when you look at it in terms of marketplace, you know, in returning it to the marketplace, we're missing that interconnectivity a little bit, and we're putting it back into the realm of speculators. And we can have a choice not to put it back into speculation, but to keep that relationship where we help guarantee society as a whole, all of us as a whole, having a decent minimum income. That's basically how simple it is. Yeah.
My name is Geraldine Perry, and I come from a family of farmers, both sides. I just finished a study for the last 9 years on my grandfather because he fell into a bank. He was a populist, and so all of the what I did was I went through all of the pricing, you know, because the populists were complaining that their prices were dropping because there was insufficient money in the economy, and they made wonderful, articulate arguments based on government information. And then we had one of the parity periods that's used, 1910 to 1914. Well, I know that what my family was earning in those are parity periods, 1910 to 1914, 1926 to 30, and then they made another one from 47, I think, to 50. So what this parity floor, if you want to call it that, that's being talked about is not where the farmers are going to be getting wealthy. It's where the farmers can at least earn enough to get the rest, keep the rest of the economy going, and distributing the wealth that's earned through raw materials. All new wealth is going to come through the soil. Now, we're talking about farm efficiency. So there's, I think the latest figure is that there's 10 units of energy used for every unit of food that's produced. We cannot live in that kind of a situation. My goal, and what I've been doing for the last 20 years, is going out of my way not to purchase food from Panera Bread that I just ate. I get it from my local farmer, and I pay him pretty money for it, and he's not affording brand new cars every year. So, you know, I think we've got some of this way we look at, how the economy is running a little bit upside down, and that's why I'm interested in this.
What I recall from the 1950s was that there were severe restrictions on how much farmers could plant. They had to leave a lot of land unused. And at the same time, there were significant surpluses building up in government warehouses. I remember particularly the surplus of butter, but I think there were surpluses of grains as well. And that kind of thing reflects the imbalance of having guaranteed prices that are greater than the cost of production. We throughout the 20th century, we're in this time of technological change where we had to, well, if we're going to have a market economy, we had to have a lot fewer farmers. And what makes farmers give up farming is not being able to make money. I think it would have made a lot more sense to give pensions to farmers than to have parity. But giving pensions to farmers sounds like welfare, and parity sounds like fairness. And so it wouldn't have been popular for farmers to get pensions to leave farming. So anyway, I understand that it's unpleasant to deal with this depopulation of rural areas that's gone on as a result of the technological improvement. But if we were going to have a world where we continue to have a significant rural population and keep the corporations out, we would have had to do things somewhat differently. Just one more point and I'll stop, and that is that I agree that it's important that the soil not be depleted. And I would be all in favor of a special tax, a severance tax, on people who deplete their soil.
Can I just add a couple things there? When surpluses were reported, when surpluses were reported many times, at least from what I studied, there weren't really surpluses. There were a lot of hungry people running. This is one of the major concerns of the populace. We had this Mary Yellen running around doing it on the lecture circuit, talking about how, we've got 10,000 little children starving in the streets and women on the East Coast selling their virtue for a slice of bread. And so we're told we produce too much, and yet they can't afford to eat it, to buy the food. And at the same time, that we can't afford to send it, anyway. They were in debt. They were swimming in debt. And the same thing was going on, I believe, in the 50s. I know in the 40s. The conservation program that started in the 30s was because of the Roosevelt's agriculture secretary. Got his name.
Wallace.
What was it?
It was Wallace.
Wallace.
Wasn't it?
That doesn't ring a bell, but it could be.
Well, he was when the sheriff of Chicago thing came in. He was the guy who was the agriculture secretary.
Is that the one that talked Roosevelt into the terracing and various methods of farming to preserve the soil was basically what it was about. So whether those were continued through the 50s, and that's what you're referring to, I'd like to probably have more of a conversation about that later.
I have two stories. One, when I was teaching mediation, we used the story of an enormous pile of fruit as high as the ceiling, and having a group of people who needed to figure out what to do with it. And the people were all standing around the pile and then went into another room to come up with a solution. And one person had only seen bananas and wanted a solution to deal with bananas. Someone on the other side of the pile was looking at only oranges, and they had a different solution. And the exciting, wonderful thing is here we have a group of people who are looking at the money system from agriculture. And I think that's a really important, wonderful path towards what he's calling sound money. And at the same time, systems matter. My background is in Montessori education. I've, over the years, had countless discussions with teachers of traditional education. And they very often say, well, kids are just really difficult. You need, school's boring. You need to have a start chart where you put stars on it when they do a good job, and then, there need to be consequences when they don't get their homework. Well, a Montessori teacher has a lot of evidence that kids, the natural learners they are at 2 years old, can continue all the way up, and they will be eager, responsible, dedicated learners all the way up through school when the system is created to support those qualities. So I'm a little wary of data that's coming from the 40s and 50s because it's data that was gathered in our existing system. So whereas all that data may be true, and applying it within the existing system might make the difference that you want, But the existing system is one that shifts wealth to the very, very wealthy. And when you look at those exponential curves of the past century, and when you look at the charts of the disparity that's been growing, it isn't just the farmers. I mean, as you mentioned, really, it's literally everybody else. The farmers maybe have been at the forefront of that, but we are approaching the place where everyone except the very, very wealthiest is going to be left out. So that was just my caution, that we may not need the kinds of strategies and plans you have, those policies, in a monetary system that is just and creates a level playing field.
Well, that's possibly, that could be the true, but I don't think that the farmer has always been for millennia, the first one in line for the front. When you're talking about the exponential growth of debt, in the 50s, so the parity formula was from 42 to 52. So in the 50s, if you look at the charts for the growth of debt, that since the Federal Reserve was created, it goes up right in the 50s. All of a sudden, it starts ballooning after 52. And that
You're saying after parity ended?
yes, after parity ended, after the parity ended. And you have to remember that when parity was in place, it was helping to pay for the war. We had all of this new machinery and all of the stuff that was used to fight the war was being paid for through, because you had the first point of production starting to create the wealth through the rest of the economy.
So it's a microphone, right?
You also had that 90% tax on the wealthiest Americans during that period. And I've looked at every single financial report from the Fed back to 1913 and the size of the money supply. Well, it's gone up and down a little bit. It's a pretty, you average it averages out to 8% a year. So that 8% increase in the 40s and 50s with the 90% tax on the very wealthy people allowed us to do many different things. And it's really hard to judge a correspondence and a cause and effect. And where I don't doubt at all that information is accurate in terms of the correspondence with those policies, it may not have been cause and effect because of the system and because of other things.
Well, I keep thinking, the food's very important, right? And it's like the base of the economy, really, because, and always has been, because we eat 3 times a day. And if the trucks stop rolling, the shelves would be empty in 3 days. And so that just, massive amount of shipping going on, there's a massive amount of pollution that comes from farming, there's a massive amount of bank involvement in farming, and land prices being out of reach of most people who want to farm. I know people who want to farm, they just can't afford the land to do it, and you can't hardly make a living at it either, but some of them are willing to try if they could afford the land. But so that whole system has been kind of like every other labor situation where capital is eliminating the labor as much as possible, eliminating the people out of the system, being able to earn a living in that and trying to replace it with technological systems. Now this idea that this is an advancement in technological, it may be an advancement in technology, but it is not an advancement in agriculture. It is a degrading of agriculture because it is a degrading of the soil. And it is a degrading of the care that it takes to grow healthy, nutritious, dense food. And that can only be done by establishing local food production, getting back to people growing real food in really careful ways that actually build soil instead of degrading soil. The chemicals that we're putting on soil now, it treats the soil like it's just a sterile medium, but the chemicals are to grow the plants, they're not to feed the soil. And how you feed the soil is with life. So, you know, that's the fertility of soil is in direct relation to the life in the soil. And those chemicals kill the life in the soil. And so that needs to be reversed. And so I just think parity is a good way to do that so that farmers then have a way to be able to afford to put money back into their soil and put organic material in. Well, Lane Ingram has come up with ways that we can grow soil
Let me
grow the
comment.
fertility.
Let me, in terms of, I want to get to Nick's thinking, make an analogy today, get to Virginia's thinking and Howard's thinking. So I'm going on a tour here, so. We'll go backwards, maybe that'll be the easiest way, but Howard's talking about healthy soil. And Virginia is talking about, from a Montessori perspective, a healthy classroom. I'm on the public school side. And in Chicago Public Schools, I was part of the union, and the lead person in the union, or part of the core, which is Karen Lewis's group that's in the leadership now. She's just retired. Actually, she retires tomorrow. But when we talk about the soil going sterile, in our classrooms, I saw in the late 90s, Chicago getting a law passed for efficiency purposes. We don't need so many teachers. You know why? Because we can pass a law in Illinois that says Chicago children don't need to have physical exercise every day, just once a week. We can get rid of, it would be 80%, but in reality, they got rid of 50% of the gym teachers in the late 90s. Oh, we got budget problems, early 2000s, a lot more money's going to the banks, but I won't go into that. I did that at another conference, and we'll keep it there. What happened then was, to balance the budget, oh, you have art and music in your classroom, in your school. Pick one or the other, but not both, because that's about what you're going to be able to afford. And then they went on and on. Teachers' aides, special ed people. And what you're creating, and as an analogy to Howard, sterile soil, was sterile children. You gotta feed children many, many, many imaginative opportunities so they can discover their natural gifts. And if you're not giving them stuff, they're not gonna make it. And I can tell you, my parents were both teachers. I've lived and breathed it as an anthropologist. I've worked with teachers in Mexico, El Salvador, 3 different schools there, all over Native America and Alaska and in Chicago and Illinois, Southern Illinois. We need more educators. We need more adults. We need more caring people in our classrooms. And for efficiency reasons, maybe I don't want to give, the excess teachers. We're getting down to, we got 2% of the population farmers from, say, 20 at an earlier time. And we're knocking down teachers the same way. We were expecting to need double the teachers by now, but we now have half from about where we were about 8 years ago, just 8 years ago. And it's all budget problems. How are we going to lead our lives? Now let's make an analogy from what Nick says and bring it up to the present. In the same way, farmers, the quality of farming, we may want to go towards organic farming and everything else. But the analogy for today is in the industrial section, with jobs going overseas and US people not having jobs. So and Virginia wants to get, how do we protect those? How do we protect ourselves? How do we create this future? So let's look at the need area. And this comes from, they've said it in different ways, from Michael Kumoff and Goro Yamaguchi. Yamaguchi, in his systems dynamics modeling, is saying, in an easy way he explains it in common English is the GDP gap, gross domestic product gap. The gap is putting your underemployed, your unemployed, and maybe you're misemployed, your PhDs are doing barista at Starbucks, and they could be creating new forms of energy in physics, right, Howard? Anyhow, so you have that loss of potential, and that's your gap. Now, we know this in economics, that you can always fill that gap. You could create or counterfeit money. It's not inflation to create the money to put people to work with decent jobs and a decent benefits and a decent life. And the NEED Act can provide that. So if you've got the NEED Act, the question then for us is, if you've got the NEED Act and you can put people to work and you can right the soil, you can right education with enough people working with our children, our next generation, how are we going to do that? How are we going to do that monetarily? The NEED Act sort of gives us the prime way to do it, but now to put us into harmony so the money doesn't go shifting, so it's more normalized, having some sorts of insurance policies. Now let's go back to Nick's point one more time, is say the economy's ready to change. Maybe we can go to organic farming, not from 20 to 2%, maybe it's only 10%, and we get healthy soil. Then we gotta decide still, how do we wanna live as society in a robotic age, et cetera? What does it mean to be a human and to have a quality life? And what does it mean for us to create our insurance policy so we care about the people across the street and down the way, that they have a living way about them? And there's the Georges, there's many schools of thought, and we can look at them, all of them. As an educator, when I work with students on this problems, I give them an open book so they can create their own monetary system. And some of them are into PPI, some of them are into other different, they come up with all sorts of great ideas. I'll give you a few. Social Security money versus wild money. So some of the money you get is your Social Security money. Then there's another money you can get, that's your wild money. You can go gambling with that money. But kids are using their imaginations to think and come up with new places. I want to give them the tools as a central bank thinker, our monetary system thinker, that it should be part of their civic education. Thank you.
Is there no call? How many more questions do we get to have, Jamie?
Well, keep going as long as you want.
All right.
Probably get tired.
Good.
And so we've got arranged to go to a sort of bar restaurant. We can carry on the conversation there.
Right.
We'll do it tomorrow. John will his presentation is very brief, so we should be able to put it in tomorrow. It'll actually dovetail nicely, I think, with some of the other presentations on tomorrow as well. So.
Paul had a question or comment.
Okay. Maybe it's my imagination, but it seems like we're dancing around something and not saying it. The CC word, corporate capitalism, really is, where is that 70% that the farmers aren't getting going? And it's a global problem, and maybe it's not politically correct to point out that I think a lot of this lies at the feet of corporate capitalism and the exploitation and wage theft, if I can use the M word, farming's a symptom, but it applies across the board. And so
Farming's a symptom, but farming, because it produces 70% of the national income, is the biggest chunk of the economy. All new wealth, if you remember, all new wealth comes from the soil. Farming, there's multipliers for every sector of, and we were going to list them, we didn't. in our sheet, but farming actually has the highest multiplier, 1 to 7 approximately. It's now, because of efficiency, technology and all that, it's now probably about 7.5, somewhere roughly about there. So for every dollar that the farmer is able to earn, there's $7 in national income produced. And it's because there's trade turns, you know, the raw material goes from the farmer to the miller to the baker and so on and so forth, and at each trade turn, there's an additional amount of money. So really, when you cheat the farmer, you're setting up the cycle of debt. The farmer has to go in debt. Other people who are related to the farm industry have to go in debt because they're not getting paid, and then it starts through the rest of the economy.
Just a very quick, something that triggered me. I don't believe all wealth comes from the soil. I think a lot of it comes from Virginia as a Montessori teacher.
She has to eat.
Well, that's true, but that she generates the wealth from her creativity, her efforts.
But
So
she has to eat. She
I
has to
just
eat.
feel that's-
She cannot do it without eating.
right.
That's right.
But that's not wealth. That's survival.
Well, first you have to survive to create wealth.
So what?
That's the basis of it.
So she's creating wealth.
She is creating wealth, but it's along the production chain. It's one of the trade terms.
They're just talking about the order.
I know. I just.
I don't think we're trying to start an argument, are we?
We're gonna have a riot.
Are there any closing remarks or one more question, comment? Or are you ready to wrap it up?
I have a closing remark for myself. The thing that originally attracted me to parity, to begin to study it, is it was the first time I could understand how an economy worked. You know, I tried to take economics, and I dropped the class because the teacher said, well, these are the assumptions that you have to have for this, and I didn't agree with any of the assumptions. And the picture, the description of how an economy works through the eyes of parity is for the whole economy, and it makes sense to me because the inputs to the rest of the economy they have to come from the earth, and it made sense. It's a policy for the entire economy. That's what the point I'm making.
Entire planet.
Anybody else?
Well, is Jamie going to lead the conversation about where we're going next? Jamie's out taking care of chairs. He needs to be drug in here.
I can mention it. At 6:30, we all in this room have a reservation at the Exchequer. And for those of you who are not from Chicago, that's one of Al Capone's restaurants. So you all need to learn a little bit of Chicago history and learn to speak with a Chicago accent. But anyhow.
That's gonna be hard.
Yeah, but anyhow,
Jamie's gonna
the
need a lot of
Exchequer,
work.
the address is
Chicago accent.
226 South Wabash Street. So we're at State and Congress. If you get to State and Congress, you go one short block east to Wabash.
Toward the lake.
Toward the lake, thank you, Nick. And then you're gonna turn left, going north, about 3 blocks. Can you repeat the address? 226 Wabash. It's the Exchequer. You'll see a sign going right out over the street, Exchequer, and it's like 2 storefronts wide.
Is that South Wabash?
South Wabash, right.
We have our own room.
Yeah, what we have is, when you go into the Exchequer, one is a bar all along the one